The notice was orange, the color the county always used when it meant business, and it was nailed to the hangar door at a height meant to be read by a woman standing exactly where Eleanor Whitfield was standing now. Nell did not touch it. She had learned a long time ago that touching a piece of paper did not make it less true. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her canvas coat, the cold coming up off the cracked tarmac through the soles of her boots, and she read the notice twice, slowly, the way she read everything now, as if speed were a luxury she had stopped affording herself. Across the road, in front of the diner, 3 men she had known for 30 years were pretending not to watch her. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, a pressure behind her shoulder blades. One of them said something. Another one laughed, low, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about anything funny. She did not turn around. She had stopped turning around years ago. The hangar behind her was a long steel shape, gone the color of a nickel left out in the rain, its corrugated walls streaked with rust, the shape of tears, its wide sliding door chained and padlocked at the center, where the county's sticker now sat crooked beside her own lock. Weeds grew up through the seams in the concrete apron in front of it. A hawk had built a nest in the eave of the old office annex 2 summers back and never left. To anyone driving past on Route 9, it looked exactly like what everyone in town had decided, years ago, that it was: a dead man's junk, kept by a woman who couldn't let go. They were not entirely wrong about the second part. Walter had been dead 9 years. 9 winters of Nell walking out here alone, unlocking the small side door with the brass key she wore on a shoelace under her collar, and sitting for a while in the cold, quiet dark, near the shape of the airplane he had loved more than he had ever quite loved explaining himself. She did it the way other widows visited a grave. It cost her nothing but time, and time out here was the one thing she still had in any real supply. Money was the thing she did not have. The taxes on the hangar and its 3 acres had crept up faster than her savings could answer them, the way debts do when you are living on a modest pension and a stubborn refusal to sell. She had missed 2 payments. Then a third. The county did not send a letter after the third one. It sent a man in a county truck to nail an orange notice to a locked door, and it gave her 11 days to either pay $11,000 she did not have, or watch parcel 114B go up for auction to whoever wanted a flat piece of land near the county road. She knew exactly who wanted it. Richard Cole's name was already stitched into half the conversation in town, the way certain names get stitched into a place before anything is even decided. Cole Development had been buying up frontage along Route 9 for 2 years, turning old fields into rows of identical townhomes with names like Meadowbrook and Whispering Pines that had never had a meadow or a pine on them in their lives. The hangar sat on the last unbroken stretch of flat land between the county road and the river, and everyone in town understood, in the vague, comfortable way people understand things they have decided are none of their business, that once the old Whitfield place went, the last of what the airfield used to be would go with it. Behind her, a truck slowed on the road. She heard the window come down before she heard the voice. Still standing out there talking to a padlock, Nellie? She knew the voice without turning. Gary Whitfield had a way of saying her name. Nellie, not Nell, never Nell, because Nell was what Walter called her, and Gary had spent 30 years finding small ways to remind her that Walter wasn't here to call her anything anymore. "Morning, Gary," she said, to the hangar door, not to him. "You get my letter?" "I got it. You gonna answer it, or you gonna let the county answer it for you?" She didn't say anything. Down the road, the truck idled another moment, engine ticking, and then Gary made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh, the sound of a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was only waiting, a little impatiently, for the world to catch up to him. 11 days, Nellie, he said. "I'm trying to help you here. Nobody else is going to make you a fair offer on a scrapyard." The truck pulled away. She listened to it go, the tires humming on the cold asphalt, and she let herself breathe out slowly through her nose, the way she had taught herself to do, instead of the things she actually wanted to do, which mostly involved throwing something. She was 61 years old. She had buried a husband, raised a daughter, mostly alone in the years he was flying, and outlasted 2 recessions and 1 flood that had taken the old barn, but somehow spared the hangar, as if the hangar itself had decided a long time ago that it wasn't going anywhere. She had been called stubborn by people who meant it as an insult, and sentimental by people who meant it as a kindness, and she had stopped, a long time ago, correcting either of them. What none of them knew, what she herself only half believed some cold mornings, standing here with her hand resting flat against the freezing steel of the door, was that Walter had told her, the week before he died, that there would come a day when she would need to open the inner bay. Not the outer hangar, where the shape of the old plane sat under a canvas tarp and a film of dust that she disturbed only with her footprints. The inner bay, the smaller steel door at the back of the building that had been welded, then bolted, then locked with a mechanism she had never once seen him use in front of her. Not yet, he'd told her, more than once, over more than 20 years, whenever she'd asked. "You'll know when it's time, Nell. I promise you'll know." She had believed him the way you believe a man you have loved since you were 23, which is to say completely, and without needing it to make sense. 11 days did not feel like a coincidence. It felt like the last possible moment for a promise to still mean anything. She reached up and closed her hand around the brass key at her collar, cold through the fabric of her shirt, and for the first time in 9 years, she let herself wonder, seriously, whether not yet had finally, quietly, become now. Behind her, across the road, someone laughed again. She still didn't turn around, but this time, it was not because she had stopped caring what they thought. It was because she had just remembered something Walter said in that same conversation, the very last thing, before he'd kissed the top of her head and gone back to whatever he'd been fixing in the shop that week. Something she had let herself forget, on purpose, because it had frightened her a little at the time, and it frightened her more now. "When you finally open it, Nell," he'd said, "don't do it alone. Get Frank first. He'll know what you're looking at before you do." Part 2. Life before the inciting event. The farmhouse sat a quarter-mile down the gravel drive from the hangar, small and white and honest, the kind of house that had never pretended to be anything more than what it was. Nell had lived in it for 38 years. She knew which step on the porch stairs groaned and which one didn't, which window stuck in July, which cabinet door needed to be lifted slightly on its hinge before it would close. She knew the house the way she knew her own hands, and some mornings, doing the dishes alone at the sink, where she used to do them with Walter drying beside her, that familiarity was the only thing that got her through breakfast. Her days had a shape to them now, worn smooth by repetition, the way a creek stone is worn smooth by water. She woke before the sun, made 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light come up grey, and then gold, over the tree line beyond the airfield. She fed the 6 hens she kept more out of habit than need. She walked the fence line twice a week to check for storm damage, because a broken fence unattended became an expensive fence, and expensive was a word she had learned to fear the way other people feared illness. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times if the ache in her chest was particular, she walked out to the hangar in the last hour of daylight and let herself in through the side door. She never told anyone this. Sarah suspected it, she thought, from the careful way her daughter asked, on their Sunday phone calls, whether Nell had been getting out much, whether she was eating, whether she was keeping busy. The soft interrogations of a grown child trying to manage a parent's grief from 400 miles away without saying the word grief out loud. "I'm keeping busy, Sarah," Nell told her. "Most Sundays," which was true in the way that most careful answers are true. accurate, and also not the whole of it. The whole of it was that she sat on an overturned crate in the cold quiet of that hangar, near the canvas-covered shape of the plane Walter had spent 15 years restoring in his retirement, and she talked to him. Not out loud usually, just in the part of her mind that had never quite accepted that the conversation was over. She told him about the hens, about Sarah's promotion, about the particular blue of the sky that day. She did not, in 9 years, ever once, ask him out loud why he had made her wait this long for whatever was behind the inner door. It had felt, for a long time, like a kind of faith, the not asking, like something you didn't disturb, because disturbing it might prove it was never really there. The town's patience with her faith had run out years before hers had. It had started small, the way these things do. A comment at the hardware store about how somebody ought to talk sense into that Whitfield woman before the county did it for her. A silence that fell over a table at the diner when she walked in, followed by a too friendly greeting that arrived a beat too late to be sincere. Nobody in town was cruel to her face. Not exactly. They were worse than cruel, in a way, because they were kind at her. The specific brand of small-town kindness that carries an undertone of pity so thick you could stand a spoon in it. Bless her heart, still keeping that old wreck. You'd think she'd let it go by now. Somebody should really do something about Nell Whitfield. She had heard every version of it. She had stopped, a long time ago, correcting any of them, because correcting them would have required an explanation she did not have, and she was not going to stand in the cereal aisle of the county grocery store trying to defend a promise made by a dead man to a room full of people who had already made up their minds. Gary made up his mind faster than anyone. He had been trying to get his hands on the Hangar property since the week of Walter's funeral, when he had first suggested, with what he probably genuinely believed was tact, that Nell shouldn't have to deal with all that, and that he'd be happy to take it off her hands for what he called a fair number and what her lawyer, years later, would call an insult dressed up in a handshake. She had said no then. She had said no every year since, in every form the question arrived in. Friendly, then irritated. Then, in the last 2 years, openly impatient, as if her continued ownership of the property were a personal inconvenience to him, rather than simply her right. What Gary did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Walter's will had left the hangar and its contents to Nell, alone, outright, no conditions, drafted and notarized 4 months before he died. An unusual amount of foresight for a man who had, as far as anyone could tell, no reason to think his heart would give out at 64 on a Tuesday morning, while he was walking across that very tarmac to open the hangar doors for the day. Nell had never told Gary the terms of the will in detail. She had let him believe, because it was easier than arguing, that the property was simply hers by default, a widow's inheritance rather than a husband's deliberate, careful choice. She thought about that choice more, lately, about the 4 months. About what Walter might have known, or feared, or planned for in that window of time before he died. Time enough to update a will, not enough, apparently, to tell his wife why. Sarah flew in the 2nd week of October, ostensibly for a long weekend, though Nell recognized a rescue mission when her daughter arrived carrying it in a duffel bag with too many days' worth of clothes for a long weekend. "You should have called me the second that notice went up," Sarah said, standing in the kitchen in her city coat, looking, Nell thought, entirely too much like Walter when she was worried. Same crease between the eyebrows, same stubborn set to the jaw. "I'm calling you now. 11 days later. I had it handled." "Mum," Sarah set her bag down harder than she needed to. "You do not have an $11,000 tax bill handled. You have it in a drawer somewhere, unopened, don't you?" She did, in fact, have it in a drawer, unopened, for 4 days before the county truck had made the drawer irrelevant. She did not say this. "I'm going to open the inner bay," Nell said instead. and watched her daughter go very still. Sarah had grown up hearing about the inner bay, the way children grow up hearing about a grandparent's old country, a place that was real but never visited, discussed but never explained. Walter used to call it his workshop when Sarah was small, and tell her, half laughing, that it wasn't ready for company yet. As she got older, the answer had calcified into something closer to a family joke. Ask your father, he'll tell you when he's ready, until he wasn't around to ask anymore. And the joke had quietly become one more thing they didn't talk about, out of respect for a grief that had no clear edges. Dad's workshop, Sarah said now, carefully. The one you've never once let me see. I've never once seen it myself. In 9 years. In 22, Nell said. He built that inner bay before you were born, Sarah. I asked him about it more times than I can count. He always said, not yet. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, more for something to hold than for the warmth. He told me, right before he died, that I'd know when it was time. And I think, she stopped, started again. I think 11 days is time. Sarah didn't argue, which surprised her. Her daughter had inherited plenty of Walter's stubbornness, but also, it turned out, some of his instinct for knowing which battles weren't worth fighting. Then we're not doing it alone, Sarah said. Whatever's back there, we're not opening it alone. Your father said the same thing. Nell almost smiled. He said to get Frank first. Then we get Frank first. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old storm window over the sink, the way it had rattled it every October for 38 years. An ordinary sound, in an ordinary kitchen, in a life that was, for 11 more days, still recognizably her own. Later that night, unable to sleep, Nell sat alone at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, and let herself do something she rarely allowed. She let herself remember, in full, the day Walter had given her the brass key. It had been early in their marriage, barely 2 years in the small rented house they'd lived in, before they'd saved enough for the farm. She had found the key in his flight bag by accident, looking for a pen, and had held it up, teasing him, asking what old lockbox he was hiding from her. She remembered exactly how his face had changed, not guilty, not evasive, but suddenly, uncharacteristically serious, the easy pilot's grin sliding away into something she'd rarely seen on him before. That's not for now, he'd told her, taking it gently from her hand. That's for later. Someday I'm going to build something, Nell, and when I do, this key is going to matter more than anything else I ever give you. I need you to keep it safe, and not ask me why. Not yet. Can you do that for me? She had asked why. Of course, more than once over the following years, the way any young wife would ask. And every time, he had given her some version of the same answer. Patient, warm, immovable. Not yet. You'll know when it's time. She had stopped asking somewhere in her 40s, not because her curiosity had faded, but because she had come, slowly, to understand that the not asking was itself a kind of trust she was offering him, and that trust, given freely and without conditions, was perhaps the truest currency of their marriage. She thought now, turning the memory over the way she'd turned over every memory of him in the 9 years since he'd died, that she had never once regretted giving him that trust, even now, even sitting at a cold kitchen table with an 11-day deadline hanging over her head, and a lifetime of unanswered questions finally, dizzyingly, close to being answered. Whatever waited behind that inner door, she understood, had never really been a secret kept from her. It had been a promise, held carefully, for exactly the moment she needed it most. And if there was one thing 38 years of marriage to Walter Whitfield had taught her, it was that the man had never once broken a promise in his life, not even the ones that took him 20 years and a locked steel door to finally keep. She finished her cold tea, rinsed the cup, and went up to bed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming of the empty side of the bed at all. Part 3. Inciting Discovery. Frank Delacroix had known Walter Whitfield for 41 years, since the two of them had worked the same regional cargo route out of the county airfield, back when the airfield still had a working control tower and a coffee machine that anyone could remember functioning. He had retired from wrenching on other men's engines a decade ago, but he still kept his coveralls pressed and his shop keys on his belt, because a man's habits, he liked to say, outlive a man's job by a good long while. He was 70 years old and moved like it, slow and deliberate, but there was nothing slow about his eyes when Nell told him, standing in his driveway with her hands jammed in her coat pockets against the cold, that she was finally ready to open the inner bay. He didn't ask her why now. He didn't ask her what had taken so long. He looked at her for a moment, the particular long look of a man doing arithmetic in his head that had nothing to do with numbers, and then he said, "I've been wondering when you'd come ask me that." "You knew," Nell said. "It wasn't a question. I knew there was something to know," Frank said. "Walter didn't tell me what. He wasn't a man who told you more than you needed, and for a long time, what I needed to know was nothing." He reached for his jacket off the hook by the door. "He did tell me one thing, near the end, made me promise it." "What's that?" "That when the day came, I wasn't to let you go in there scared." Frank's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Man knew you better than you gave him credit for, Nell. He knew exactly what kind of day this would be." They drove out to the hangar in Frank's truck, Sarah following in her rental car, the three of them arriving on the gravel apron just as the last of the afternoon light was turning the rust on the hangar walls, the color of a bruise healing. The Orange County notice was still nailed to the outer door, curling slightly at one corner now, as if even the paper understood it was only a temporary kind of authority. Inside, the outer hangar smelled the way it always smelled, motor oil gone old and sweet, dust, the particular mineral smell of cold concrete. The shape of Walter's restored plane sat under its canvas tarp in the center of the space, exactly where it had sat for 9 years. And for a moment, Nell let her hand rest against the curve of the wing beneath the fabric, the way she always did, a small private hello. Then she led them toward the back wall, where the inner bay door waited. It did not look like much. That was, she thought, the strange thing about it. She had built this door up in her mind for so many years, in so many late-night imaginings, that the reality of it felt almost anticlimactic. Just a steel door, slightly smaller than a standard garage entry, painted the same dull grey as the rest of the interior wall, distinguishable mainly by the absence of the dust that coated everything else nearby. Someone, Walter, presumably, before he died, had wiped this door down more recently than anything else in the building. There was no visible keyhole, just a flat brass plate, roughly the size of her palm, set into the door at chest height, with a narrow slot running through its center. "That's not a lock I recognize," Frank said, crouching slightly to examine it, his flashlight beam skating across the brass. "That's not hardware store hardware." Nell pulled the brass key out from under her collar, the one she'd worn on a shoelace for 9 years, without ever once trying it here, because some part of her had never quite believed this moment would come. She held it up to the slot. It was the right general size. It looked, for one held breath, like it might simply slide in and turn, the way keys were supposed to. It didn't fit. The slot was shaped wrong, narrower at one end, with what looked like a series of small ridges along one edge that her key had no matching notches for. "That's not the key," Frank said quietly. "Or not the only key." "He gave me this the day we married," Nell said, and heard her own voice come out thinner than she meant it to. "Told me to keep it close. Told me it would matter someday." Frank was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of the brass plate. Then he reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out his ring of shop keys, sorting through them with the patience of a man who had learned, over 70 years, that hurrying rarely got you anywhere faster. He stopped on one, small, dark, worn, smooth, and held it up next to Nell's brass key, turning both in the beam of Sarah's phone flashlight. "Walter gave me this, the same week he updated his will," Frank said slowly, as if the memory were only now arranging itself into meaning. "Told me it was for a lock I'd probably never see. Told me if I ever did see it, I'd know it was time, and I should bring it straight to you, no questions." He looked at Nell, something moving behind his eyes that looked almost like guilt. "I forgot about it, Nell. Truth be told, I forgot I even had it, until you stood in my driveway an hour ago." "2 keys," Sarah said, looking between them. "He split it in 2 on purpose, so neither one of us could open it alone," Nell said, and something in her chest, some old ache she had carried so long she'd stopped noticing its weight, shifted very slightly. "So I'd have to come find Frank, exactly like he told me to." Frank fit his small dark key into the slot first, turned it a quarter turn until it clicked and held, and then, wordlessly, held his hand out for Nell's brass key. She passed it to him. He fit it into a second, smaller opening she hadn't even noticed, hidden beneath a hinged brass flap, and turned both keys together, one in each hand, in a single slow motion. Somewhere deep inside the door, something heavy released, with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. The door did not swing open on its own. It simply unlocked, the way an ordinary door unlocks, waiting now for someone to actually push it. For a moment, none of them moved. The wind outside pushed at the corrugated walls of the outer hangar, a low metallic groan, and Nell realized she had been standing here for 9 years, imagining this exact instant, and had never once pictured what she would actually do when it arrived. "You don't have to be the one to open it," Sarah said softly, close beside her. "Yes," Nell said, "I do." She put both hands flat against the cold steel, the way she had put her hand against the outer hangar door that morning 11 days ago. Except this time, she did not stop at touching it. She pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that had clearly been oiled recently. Walter's doing, she understood now, some final act of preparation completed in secret in the last months of his life. And cool, still air rolled out to meet her, carrying with it a smell she hadn't expected. Not dust, not decay, but something faintly metallic and clean, like a bank vault, like a place that had been sealed on purpose to keep the world exactly out. Frank's flashlight swept across the dark interior, and Nell heard Sarah's breath catch beside her. And for a moment, standing in the doorway of a room her husband had built and hidden and guarded for over 2 decades, Eleanor Whitfield understood that whatever the town believed about her, whatever Gary believed he was owed, whatever the county's orange notice claimed about the worth of this land, none of it had ever been the whole truth. Walter had known that. He had built this room, brick by careful brick, key by careful key, to prove it, someday, when she needed proof the most. The flashlight beam found the first shape in the dark, a long, low silhouette under a fitted canvas cover, unmistakably the outline of another aircraft, smaller and sleeker than the one in the outer hangar, its lines catching the light in a way that spoke of care, of money, of decades of quiet maintenance, performed by hands that had never once let this secret slip. "Lord," Frank breathed. He actually did it. Part 4. Deeper investigation. They did not go further in that first evening. Frank insisted on it, in the gentle but immovable way he insisted on things, that they were tired, that the light was going, that whatever had waited 22 years to be found could wait one more night to be understood properly, in daylight, with clear heads. Nell wanted to argue. She looked at the covered shape of the second aircraft, at the shelving units she could make out further back in the shadow, stacked with boxes and binders, and every instinct in her wanted to keep pulling at the thread until the whole of it came loose in her hands. But she had learned, over 61 years, that Frank was rarely wrong about pacing, and so she locked the inner door again, both keys, together, the way Walter had designed it, and went home to a sleepless night that felt, for the first time in 9 years, less like grief and more like anticipation. They came back the next morning with better flashlights, a folding table, and a thermos of coffee that Sarah insisted on, because, she said, nobody was uncovering 2 decades of family secrets on an empty stomach. The second aircraft, once they pulled the canvas cover away in the grey light coming through a single high skylight Nell hadn't even known existed, turned out to be a beautifully restored twin-engine plane, smaller than Walter's showpiece in the outer hangar, but immaculately maintained, its registration numbers freshly painted, its interior, when Frank cracked the door and shone his flashlight inside, clean enough to have flown yesterday. "This isn't a hobby restoration," Frank said, running his hand along the fuselage with the reverence of a man greeting an old friend. "This is flight-ready. Somebody's been maintaining this aircraft on a schedule, recently." "Walter," Nell said. "It has to have been Walter, right up until—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Frank found the maintenance logs in a metal box bolted beneath the pilot's seat, and the dates in Walter's careful, blocky handwriting confirmed it. Entries stretching back over 15 years, the last one dated 4 days before he died. Oil changes, avionics checks. A note in the margin of that final entry that read simply, "Almost time to tell her." Nell had to sit down on the folding chair Sarah had brought. She did not cry, not exactly, but something in her chest had gone very tight and very full at once. The particular ache of finding proof that someone had loved you in ways you had never fully seen. The shelving units at the back of the bay held the rest of it, arranged with the same meticulous order Walter had brought to everything he touched. Dozens of banker's boxes, labeled in his handwriting by year, binders of paperwork, a small fireproof filing cabinet, locked, that Frank identified immediately as a document safe, the kind used for storing deeds and titles rather than cash. And, at the center of the back wall, half hidden behind a rolling tool cabinet that took the 3 of them nearly 20 minutes to work loose from where it had rusted slightly into position, a section of wall that did not quite match the rest. "That's not original construction," Frank said, running his hand along the seam. "That's a false wall. Somebody built a room inside the room." Sarah found the release mechanism before either of them did, a section of baseboard trim that shifted under her foot when she stepped back to let Frank examine the seam more closely, releasing a soft mechanical click somewhere inside the wall. The false panel swung inward an inch, just enough to show a sliver of darkness behind it, and Nell felt her pulse pick up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. They didn't open it that second day either. Frank, methodical as ever, insisted they go through the boxes and binders first, in order, the way Walter had clearly intended them to be gone through, rather than tearing straight for whatever waited behind the false wall. It was slow work, and it was, Nell found, some of the most important reading of her life. The early boxes held ordinary things, old logbooks from Walter's cargo flying years in his 20s and 30s, receipts, photographs of him young and lean beside aircraft she didn't recognize, standing in front of airstrips in places she had never known he'd flown to. There were photographs of Frank in them too, younger, both men grinning in a way Nell hadn't seen on her husband's face in years by the time she'd married him. "We flew some rough routes together, your husband and I," Frank said, going quiet over one photograph in particular, the 2 of them standing in front of a battered cargo plane somewhere, with red dirt underfoot and mountains behind them. "Some of the cargo we carried in those years, I won't pretend it was all daylight legal. Times were different. Money was hard to come by honest, sometimes, for young pilots without connections." "What kind of cargo, Frank?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph over in his weathered hands. "That's Walter's story to tell, not mine," he said finally. "But I'll say this much. Whatever he did in those years, whatever debt it put him in with people who weren't in the habit of forgiving debts, he spent the next 30 years of his life quietly paying it back down to nothing. And then some. The later boxes, the ones marked with years Nell recognized, years of her own marriage, years she remembered as ordinary, unremarkable, full of school lunches and mortgage payments and Sunday dinners, held something different entirely. Bank statements from an account she had never known existed, brokerage records, a small but steadily growing pattern of investments made quietly, consistently, over more than 2 decades, in Walter's name alone. "He never touched our joint accounts for any of this," Nell said slowly, paging through statement after statement, watching the numbers grow year over year in small, careful increments. This was separate. This whole time, this was separate. "Looks that way," Frank said, and something in his voice made her look up. "You knew about this part?" Frank set down the folder he was holding. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncomfortable, his shop-worn hands still on the table in front of him. "I knew there was money," he admitted. "I didn't know how much, and I didn't know why he kept it from you. Not exactly. Walter told me once, years back, that he was scared if you knew about it too soon, you might feel obligated to spend it on something practical, pay off the house early, fix the roof, that kind of thing, instead of letting it sit and grow the way he wanted it to. He had a plan for it, Nell, a specific one. He just never got the chance to tell you what it was before his heart gave out on him." Nell sat with that for a long moment, the cold of the inner bay settling into her hands, the weight of the folder in her lap. "He should have told me," she said quietly. "Whatever the reason, he should have told me." "Maybe," Frank said. "Or maybe he knew exactly what kind of day you'd need this for, and he knew it wasn't going to be an easy day, and he wanted to make sure that when it came, there wasn't a single soul on this earth, not the county, not Gary, not anybody standing across the road at that diner laughing at you, who could argue with what was sitting behind that wall." He nodded toward the false panel, still standing open that narrow, tantalizing inch. Outside, the light was failing again. They had spent an entire second day inside the inner bay and had not yet touched what was behind the wall. Sarah, checking her phone for the first time in hours, made a small sound of frustration. "Mom, you've got 3 missed calls from Gary, and a voicemail from a number I don't recognize. County Courthouse prefix." Nell closed the folder in her lap, slowly, and felt something in her settle into place that had not been there 11 days ago. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, less like grief and more like resolve. "Let them call," she said. "Whatever's behind that wall, we finish reading what's in front of it first. Your father didn't rush this. I'm not going to either." But even as she said it, she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever waited on the other side of that voicemail was not going to wait as patiently as Walter had planned for. Part 5. Pressure, betrayal, emotional fracture. The voicemail was from a clerk at the county courthouse, polite and entirely impersonal, informing Nell that a petition had been filed requesting an emergency competency hearing regarding the management of her financial and property affairs, and that she was required to appear in 8 days' time. She listened to it twice, standing in her kitchen with her coat still on, the cold of the hangar still in her hands, and then she called Sarah in from the porch and played it a 3rd time so her daughter could hear it too. "He can't do that," Sarah said when it finished. "Can he do that?" "He can file it," Nell said. "Whether a judge takes it seriously is a different question." But she knew, even as she said it, that a filing like this did not need to succeed to do damage. It only needed to exist. It only needed to plant, in the minds of a county judge, a courthouse clerk, a town already primed to believe an old widow was in over her head, the idea that Eleanor Whitfield could no longer be trusted to run her own affairs. Once that idea existed, it would follow her into every room she walked into for the rest of her life, whether the hearing ever actually happened or not. Gary's name was on the petition. She had expected that. What she had not expected What landed in her chest like a physical blow when the courthouse finally sent her the paperwork 2 days later was the list of supporting statements attached to it, sworn affidavits from people in town describing her as increasingly withdrawn, erratic in her decision-making, prone to what one particularly damning statement called irrational attachment to worthless property at the expense of sound financial judgment. 3 of the names on those affidavits belonged to people she had considered, if not friends, at least kind acquaintances of 30 years' standing. She read their names twice, the way she'd read the tax notice, as if reading it slower might change what it said. "They talked to him," she said quietly, sitting at her kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her. "But they sat down with Gary and signed their names to this. Mum, I baked a casserole for Linda Post's mother's funeral," Nell said, staring at one particular signature. "I sat with her in that church for 2 hours. Sarah didn't have anything to say to that. There wasn't anything to say. Some betrayals didn't have a response. They only had a weight you carried afterward." Richard Cole arrived at the farmhouse the following afternoon, unannounced, driving a black pickup with the Cole Development logo on the door, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than casual clothes were supposed to cost. He stood on Nell's porch with a glossy folder under his arm and an expression arranged into practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Whitfield, I heard about the hearing. I wanted to come by personally, before things get any more difficult than they need to be." He held the folder out toward her, and when she didn't take it, set it on the porch railing instead. "I'd like to make you an offer, a generous one, enough to clear the tax debt, cover legal fees for whatever's happening with your brother-in-law, and leave you comfortable. No auction, no hearing to worry about. This could all be over by Friday. The land's not for sale, Mr. Cole. I understand it has sentimental value." His voice carried the particular smoothness of a man who had said some version of this sentence to 100 other people standing on 100 other porches. "But sentiment doesn't pay a tax bill, Mrs. Whitfield, and I'd hate to see you lose everything at auction for pennies on the dollar when I'm standing right here offering you real money, today, no strings." "I appreciate you coming by," Nell said, in a voice she kept perfectly level. "The answer's still no." Cole's smile thinned, just slightly, the practiced sympathy sliding a fraction to reveal something more businesslike underneath. "The offer has a deadline too, Mrs. Whitfield. Same one the county gave you, more or less. I'd think carefully before the answer's no forever." He left his card wedged in her screen door and drove away, and Nell stood on her porch for a long time afterward, watching the dust settle on the gravel drive, feeling the particular exhaustion of a woman being squeezed from 2 directions at once by 2 men who had each, in their own way, decided her resistance was simply a problem to be priced correctly. She stopped at the diner on her way back from the courthouse clerk's office that same afternoon, mostly because she was out of coffee at home and hadn't the energy to drive the extra 10 minutes to the grocery store in the next town, and she felt the room shift the moment the bell over the door announced her. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody said anything cruel to her face. But conversations lowered, just slightly, the particular hush of a room that has been discussing you and doesn't want to be caught at it, and she felt eyes on her back as she waited at the counter for her coffee to go. "Heard about the hearing," said a voice behind her. Doris Kepler, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, and had known Nell since they were both young mothers, pushing strollers past each other on Main Street. "That true, Nell? Gary's really trying to say you can't manage your own affairs?" "That's what the paperwork says," Nell answered, keeping her voice even. "Well," Doris glanced around, lowering her own voice slightly, though not so much that Nell couldn't hear the calculation in it. Sympathy weighed carefully against self-protection, against not wanting to be seen taking sides against a man who might, after all, turn out to be right. "I'm sure it'll get sorted." Nell paid for her coffee and did not linger, and on her way out she passed the booth where Linda Post sat with 2 other women, the same Linda Post whose name had been on one of the affidavits, whose mother's funeral casserole Nell had spent an entire evening preparing 3 years before. Linda's eyes met hers for one unguarded second, and something in her expression, not quite shame, but close to it, flickered, and then smoothed itself back into careful neutrality. Nell did not stop. She did not say anything. She had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that she was not going to spend what remained of her dignity arguing with people who had already made up their minds, and she carried that decision out to her truck, with her chin level and her steps unhurried, the way Walter used to walk across a tarmac in bad weather. Not because the wind didn't bother him, but because he'd learned a long time ago that letting it show only fed it. She cried a little in the truck, once the door was shut, and the engine was running, and there was no one left to see her do it. Not for long. Just enough to let the day's weight move through her instead of settling, and then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove home past the hangar, slowing just slightly as she passed it, the way she always did. A small private acknowledgement between herself and the building that had outlasted a flood, 9 years of gossip, and now, apparently, an 11-day deadline too. That evening, she went back out to the hangar alone, against Sarah's protests, because she needed, badly, urgently, to be near the one place in the world that still felt entirely, uncomplicatedly hers. Frank was already there when she arrived, sitting on the same overturned crate she usually sat on, his flashlight resting beside him, unlit. "I owe you an apology," he said, before she'd even gotten the outer door closed behind her. "For what?" "For more than I told you yesterday." He rubbed a hand over his face, and in the dim light, she saw, for the first time, how tired he looked, how the last 2 days had worn on him too. "Walter told me about that separate account nearly 10 years before he died, Nell. Not the details, just that it existed, and that it was for you, and that I was to say nothing until the day came that I was needed. I kept that promise. I've kept a lot of promises to that man over 41 years, and I've never once regretted keeping them." He looked up at her. "Until this week, watching you get squeezed by Gary and that developer, knowing I could have told you years ago that there was money enough sitting behind that wall to make both of them irrelevant, and I sat on my hands because a man who's been dead 9 years asked me to. That's sitting hard with me, Nell. Real hard." Nell was quiet for a moment, standing in the cold beside the shape of Walter's restored plane, feeling something complicated move through her. Not quite anger, not quite forgiveness. Something in the tangled middle of the two. "Why did he want it kept from me that long, Frank?" "The real reason. Not the roof, not the mortgage. The real one." Frank was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I think," he said finally, slowly, choosing each word the way he chose his tools, deliberately, "I think Walter knew this town. Knew what it would do to you the day it found out you had money nobody expected you to have. I think he knew Gary would come sniffing the second he smelled it, whether it was 10 years off or 20. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think he wanted you to have already proven, to yourself and everybody watching, that you could stand on your own 2 feet through the hard years first, so that when the money finally showed up, nobody could ever say you only made it because of him. Nobody could say you didn't earn every bit of what came next." It was, Nell thought, exactly the kind of stubborn, complicated, maddening logic Walter Whitfield had always operated on. The kind that came from a deep and abiding love, expressed in the most roundabout way imaginable. She didn't know, standing there, whether to be furious at him or grateful to him. She suspected, in the way you learn to suspect things about the dead, that she was going to spend the rest of her life feeling some measure of both. "There's more," Frank said, "something I should have told you the first day, and didn't, because I wasn't sure how. Tell me now." "The debt I mentioned, from our flying years." He met her eyes, steady, despite the discomfort plain on his face. It wasn't fully paid off the way I let you believe. Not in the clean way. There were people involved, the kind of people you don't just write a check to and walk away from clean. Walter spent years managing that, quietly, carefully, making sure it never touched you or Sarah. Whatever's behind that false wall, Nell, I think it isn't just money. I think it's the whole record of how he settled it. And I think there might be names in there that some folks, even now, would rather stayed buried. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the corrugated walls, and Nell felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature settle into her chest. "Then we finish it," she said. "All of it. Tomorrow. Whatever's behind that wall, I need to see it before that hearing, Frank. I need to know exactly what I'm walking into that courtroom holding." Frank nodded slowly, and in his eyes, she saw something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man finally allowed to stop carrying a secret alone. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "First light. And Nell, whatever we find in there, I'm not leaving your side again until this is finished. That much, at least, I can promise you clean." She believed him. It was, in the middle of the worst week she'd had in 9 years, the one thing that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly true. Part 6. Reveal and Truth. Opening morning came in grey and cold, frost silvering the weeds along the tarmac, and Nell walked out to the hangar before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, Sarah beside her, Frank's truck already parked on the gravel apron when they arrived. They didn't speak much as they crossed the outer hangar and unlocked the inner bay, both keys together, the mechanism releasing with the same heavy sigh it had released 2 days before. Inside, the air was still cold and clean, the shape of the second aircraft catching the thin light from the skylight above, and at the back wall, the false panel stood exactly as they'd left it, open that same narrow waiting inch. Frank pulled it the rest of the way open himself, his flashlight beam cutting into the dark space behind it, and for a moment, none of them moved. It was not large, a room perhaps 8 feet by 10, lined with the same careful order that had characterized every box and binder they'd already gone through. A small steel desk sat against one wall, a single chair pushed neatly beneath it. A row of fireproof filing boxes lined a shelf above the desk. And at the center, dominating the small space, a floor safe, its door already unlocked, standing very slightly ajar, as if Walter himself had left it that way on purpose, one final door he'd chosen not to seal. "He knew you'd get this far," Frank said quietly. "He left it open for you." Nell crossed the small room slowly, her boots loud on the concrete, and knelt in front of the safe. Inside, neatly stacked and separated by careful dividers, she found bundles of cash, not an unreasonable fortune she would learn later, once it was all counted and appraised, but a substantial one, the kind of sum that reorganizes a life. Beneath the cash, a stack of gold coins in a velvet-lined case, each one wrapped individually in soft cloth. Beneath that, deeds, not just to the hangar property, but to 2 other parcels of land Nell had never known Walter owned, purchased quietly over the years, under a small holding company bearing neither of their names. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a single oilcloth folder, a letter, addressed in Walter's handwriting to a single word, Nell. She sat back on her heels, the letter in her hands, and for a long moment she could not make herself open it. Sarah knelt beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, and Frank stood a respectful distance back, his flashlight lowered, giving her what privacy the small space allowed. Finally, she broke the seal. "Nell, if you're reading this, it means the day finally came, and I am sorrier than I can say that I'm not there beside you to see it. I've written this letter a dozen times over the years and thrown most of them away, because I never could find the words that felt honest enough for what I owed you. I'll try one more time, and this time I won't throw it away. You deserve to know the whole of it, so here it is, plain as I can make it. When I was young, younger than Sarah is now, I flew cargo for men I shouldn't have flown for. I won't pretend it was a mistake I didn't understand at the time. I understood it fine. I was broke and scared, and I told myself it was temporary, the way young men tell themselves a lot of things. By the time I understood what kind of debt I'd actually gotten myself into, it wasn't the kind you walk away from with an apology. Frank knows some of it. He's a better friend than I deserved, and he's kept his mouth shut about it for 40 years, which is more loyalty than most men manage in a lifetime. I spent the better part of 3 decades paying that debt down, not in the way those men wanted, but in the way I decided I would pay it, quietly, carefully, on my own terms, until there was nothing left owed, and nothing left for anyone to hold over me, or over you, or over Sarah. The account behind this wall, the second plane, the land under coal company, all of it came after that debt was clear. Every dollar in that safe is clean. I want you to know that for certain, because I know you, and I know you'd never rest easy spending a cent of it if you thought otherwise. I didn't tell you while I was alive because I was afraid, plainly. Afraid that if you knew too soon, you'd feel the weight of it before you needed to, the danger of it, the debt of it. And I couldn't stand the thought of you carrying that fear on top of everything else you already carried, raising Sarah while I was gone flying half the year. I told myself I'd tell you eventually, when the debt was fully settled and there was nothing left to fear. And then I kept finding reasons to wait a little longer, because once the fear was gone, I found I liked having something that was only mine to give you, someday, all at once, instead of in pieces. I know now, writing this, that it was a kind of selfishness, dressed up as protection. I'm sorry for that, Nell. I truly am. Here is what I need you to understand, and I need you to hear it as clearly as I can write it. Everything behind this wall is yours, not shared with Gary, not owed to the county beyond what's fair. Not anyone's business but yours. I've had a lawyer, a good one, discreet, not the one in town. Draw up documentation for every piece of it, updated every 2 years since Sarah was in grade school, naming you sole and irrevocable owner of the hangar, this land, the holding company, and everything held within it. That paperwork is in the fireproof box on the shelf above this desk. It is airtight, Nell. I made certain of that more than once, because I always knew, that someday somebody in this town would look at a widow alone and decide she was an easy thing to take advantage of. I wanted to make sure that whoever tried, they'd find out exactly how wrong they were. I love you the way I've loved you since the day you agreed to marry a broke young pilot with more debt than sense. Everything I built in that account, I built with you in mind, on every single page of every single ledger. I'm sorry I'm not there to see your face when you find it. I like to think I am, somehow, in whatever way a man gets to watch over the people he loved best. Take care of Sarah, take care of yourself. And Nell, don't you dare let anybody in this town make you feel small for keeping a promise to me. You kept every promise you ever made. I only wish I'd been faster about keeping mine. All my love, always. Walter Nell read it twice through before she trusted her voice enough to read any of it aloud to Sarah, and by the time she finished the second reading, none of the 3 of them in that small concrete room were entirely dry-eyed, Frank included, standing near the door with his flashlight pointed at the floor and his jaw working the particular way a man's jaw works when he's decided not to let himself cry in front of people, even people who wouldn't judge him for it. He knew, Sarah said finally, wiping her face with the back of her hand. He knew exactly what this week would look like. The hearing, Gary, Cole standing on the porch with his folder. He built all of this specifically to survive a week like this one. He built it to protect you, Frank said quietly. Both of you, whether he's here to see it work or not. Nell set the letter down carefully on the small steel desk and reached for the fireproof box on the shelf above it, her hands steadier now than they had been in days. Inside, exactly as Walter had promised. She found the paperwork. Deeds, trust documents, a formal legal opinion letter from a firm 2 counties over, bearing dates stretching back 17 years, each one updated and re-notarized on a careful 2-year cycle. The most recent revision dated less than 6 months before he died. Every document named her, and only her, as sole and irrevocable owner. There was, tucked into the very back of the box, one more item that made Nell's breath catch. A formal notarized statement, dated the same week as the most recent will revision, addressed not to her, but to any court that might one day be asked to question her competency to manage her own affairs. In it, Walter had recorded, plainly, methodically, in language his lawyer had clearly helped him sharpen into something unassailable, a detailed account of Nell's role managing their household finances for 30 years, her sound judgment, her steady hand through 2 recessions and a flood, and his own explicit, sworn opinion that she was, in his words, the most capable and clear-headed person I have ever known, and any man who suggests otherwise after I am gone is doing so for his own gain, not out of any genuine concern for her welfare. He wrote a statement, Nell said, her voice barely above a whisper, specifically in case somebody like Gary ever tried something like this. He knew his brother, Frank said simply, better than Gary ever gave him credit for. Sarah was already photographing every document with her phone, methodical in the particular way her mother had raised her to be methodical under pressure, building a record before anyone had the chance to question it. "We need Walter's lawyer," Sarah said. "The discreet one, whoever that is. If we can get them on record confirming all of this before the hearing." "I know who it is," Frank said. "Man's name is Halloran. Works out of the county seat, not here in town. I flew him and Walter to a meeting once, years back. Never asked what it was about. If Walter trusted him with all this, I'd bet good money he's still got copies of everything on file." Nell stood slowly, the letter in one hand, the fireproof box balanced against her hip, and looked around the small concrete room her husband had built in secret, over 2 decades. Every inch of it, a quiet, patient, maddening act of love she had waited 9 years to fully understand. "Then we call him today," she said. "The hearing's in 6 days. Gary wants to stand up in that courtroom and tell a judge I can't be trusted to run my own life." Something steadied in her voice, something that had been bending under pressure for 11 days and had just, finally, found its footing again. "I think it's time he found out exactly who he's been underestimating." Outside, the wind had died down, and the thin morning light was strengthening through the skylight, falling across the open safe, the letter, the stack of careful documentation her husband had spent the last years of his life quietly assembling for exactly this moment. A fortune, yes, but more than that, a shield, built years in advance, by a man who had understood, better than anyone in town ever would, exactly what his wife was capable of surviving, and exactly what she deserved to be handed once she'd survived it. Part 7. Climax, Justice, Restoration, Ending Reflection. The 6 days between the reveal and the hearing passed in a blur of careful, deliberate motion that felt, to Nell, almost like flying itself. The particular calm that settles over a person once they have finally stopped drifting and started steering. Halloran, Walter's discreet lawyer, turned out to be a quiet, precise man in his 60s, who kept an office 2 counties over. Specifically, he explained when Nell and Sarah sat across from his desk, because Walter had wanted a lawyer with no ties to their town, no golf games with Gary, no coffee shop familiarity with anyone who might one day have reason to pressure him for information. "Your husband," Halloran said, sliding a thick folder across the desk toward her, "was one of the most careful men I ever represented. He came to me 17 years ago and told me, plainly, that he wanted to build something that couldn't be undone by grief, greed, or bad luck. I believe he succeeded. He tapped the folder. Every document in that fireproof box has a matching copy on file with my office, dated and notarized on the same schedule. If your brother-in-law's petition proceeds to a hearing, Mrs. Whitfield, I would be glad to attend personally. Nell paid the tax debt on the 6th day, walking into the county assessor's office with a cashier's check that covered the full amount plus penalties, watching the clerk's carefully neutral expression flicker, just slightly, when she processed the payment. The orange notice came down from the hangar door that same afternoon. Nell did not go to watch it happen. She had, she found, less interest in that particular satisfaction than she'd expected. The debt paid was simply a fact now, unremarkable, the way most true things are once they're finally settled. Richard Cole called twice that week. She let both calls go to voicemail and did not return either one. Gary did not call at all. She heard, second-hand, through Sarah, who heard it from a cousin, that he had grown strange and quiet once word got around town that the tax notice had come down, that Nell Whitfield had somehow, mysteriously, found the money to save the property after all. The town's whispers shifted register almost overnight, from pity to something closer to bewildered curiosity, the specific hum of a place that senses a story is about to break wide open and cannot yet see the shape of it. The competency hearing was held in the small county courthouse on a cold Thursday morning, in a wood-paneled room that smelled faintly of radiator dust and old paper, before a judge named Ortiz who had, Halloran mentioned quietly on the courthouse steps beforehand, a well-earned reputation for having very little patience with frivolous filings. Gary arrived in the same ill-fitting blazer Nell had seen him wear to every important occasion for a decade, his manila folder of paperwork tucked under one arm, and he did not look at her as he took his seat at the petitioner's table. His own attorney, a younger man Nell didn't recognize, shuffled papers with the slightly overcompensating energy of someone who suspected, without yet knowing why, that his case was weaker than his client had promised him. The hearing opened with Gary's attorney reading through the affidavits, the same statements Nell had already read at her kitchen table, describing her as withdrawn, erratic, irrationally attached to worthless property. Judge Ortiz listened without expression, making notes, and when the attorney finished, she turned her attention to Halloran, seated beside Nell at the respondent's table. Counsel, I understand you have documentation you'd like entered into the record. I do, Your Honor. What followed took the better part of an hour, and Nell sat through all of it with her hands folded quietly in her lap, watching the color slowly, steadily drain out of Gary Whitfield's face as Halloran laid out, piece by careful piece, exactly what his late brother had built and why. The deeds, entered as evidence, established beyond any dispute that the hangar property, the 2 additional parcels, and the holding company that owned them all, belonged solely and irrevocably to Eleanor Whitfield, per documentation updated and notarized every 2 years for the past 17 years. Documentation that predated, by more than a decade, any claim Gary's filing suggested about Nell's supposed incapacity. The bank and brokerage records entered next demonstrated a pattern of careful, consistent, entirely legal financial management stretching back over 20 years. A pattern, Halloran pointed out, that directly contradicted any suggestion of erratic or unsound judgment, since the funds in question had grown steadily under conditions requiring exactly the kind of patience and discipline the petition claimed Nell lacked. And finally, Halloran read into the record Walter's own sworn statement, the one written specifically to anticipate a moment exactly like this one, describing Nell's competence, her judgment, and his explicit warning that any challenge to her capability, mounted after his death, should be viewed with significant skepticism regarding the challenger's true motives. Judge Ortiz read the statement herself, twice, in silence, before setting it down and looking directly at Gary across the courtroom. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, in the flat, measured tone of a judge who had made up her mind and was choosing her words carefully anyway. "I want to be plain with you about something. This court takes questions of elder capability seriously, and I don't doubt that concern for a family member's welfare can come from a genuine place. But what I've seen entered into evidence this morning is not a picture of a woman who is struggling to manage her affairs. It is a picture of a woman who has, for the better part of a decade, been quietly and successfully honoring a complicated commitment to her late husband, under considerable financial and social pressure, while the people around her assumed, apparently including you, that she was simply too foolish to understand what she was doing." She turned a page of the file in front of her. "I also note for the record that the timing of this petition coincides precisely with public knowledge of the tax notice on Mrs. Whitfield's property, and precedes, by only days, the discovery of substantial assets that would, by the terms of her late husband's estate documents, pass to her alone. I will leave it to Mr. Whitfield's own conscience to consider what conclusions a reasonable observer might draw from that timing." The courtroom was very quiet. Nell did not look at Gary. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not particularly want to. Whatever satisfaction she might once have imagined feeling in this exact moment had already been quietly used up over the last 11 days, spent instead on smaller, steadier things. Frank's flashlight beam finding the second aircraft in the dark, Sarah's hand on her shoulder in that small concrete room, Walter's handwriting on a letter that had waited 2 decades to be read. "This petition is dismissed," Judge Ortiz said, "with prejudice. Mrs. Whitfield's competency and financial judgment are not in question, and I would strongly caution against any future filings of this nature, absent significantly more compelling evidence than what has been presented today." She brought her gavel down once, a small, unremarkable sound in a wood-paneled room, and it was, Nell thought, a strange thing, how such a quiet sound could carry the full weight of 9 years, finally, formally, being believed. Outside the courthouse, on the wide stone steps, Sarah wrapped both arms around her mother and held on for a long moment, and Frank stood a respectful distance back, with his hands in his coveralls pockets, wearing an expression of quiet, unshowy pride that reminded Nell, sharply and sweetly, of the way Walter used to look at her across a room when he thought she wasn't watching. Gary came down the steps a few minutes later, alone, his attorney already gone, his manila folder still tucked uselessly under his arm. He stopped a few feet from Nell, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "I didn't know," he said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. "About the money. I want you to know that. I didn't file that petition because I knew what was out there. I filed it because—" He stopped, and something in his face, some old familiar bitterness, seemed to deflate slightly. Because Walter always made it look easy. The flying, the money, the way people trusted him. And I got tired of watching his widow hold on to a piece of that legacy that I never got a share of, while I was standing here with nothing to show for being the brother who stayed. It was, Nell understood, as close to an honest thing as Gary Whitfield had said to her in 9 years. And she found, standing on those cold courthouse steps, that she had enough grace left in her, after everything, to receive it without cruelty. "You could have asked me for help, Gary," she said quietly, "instead of trying to take it. Walter would have wanted that too, whatever else he kept from either of us." Gary didn't answer. He nodded once, short and stiff, and walked to his truck without looking back, and Nell understood that whatever came next between them, an apology, a reconciliation, nothing at all, was not a conversation that would resolve itself on courthouse steps in the cold. Some things, she had learned, took as long as they took. Frank walked her and Sarah to the truck a few minutes later, quieter than usual, and it was Sarah who finally asked him what was sitting so visibly on his mind. "I keep thinking about the years I could have told her sooner," he admitted, leaning against the truck bed, his breath fogging in the cold. Not the amount, not the details, just that there was something, that she wasn't out here fighting this alone the whole time, even if she didn't know it. "You kept a promise to your best friend for 40 years, Frank," Nell said. "I'm not going to let you stand here and turn that into something to be ashamed of. If anything, you kept the promise better than I sometimes wish you had. And I mean that with more gratitude than I know how to say out loud." Frank looked at her for a long moment, something easing very slightly in the set of his shoulders. The particular relief of a man being released, at last, from a debt he'd been quietly paying down in guilt for far longer than he needed to. "Your husband picked good people to trust, Nell," he said. "I'd like to think that includes me, most days." "It does," she said. "Every day." Word of the hearing's outcome moved through town faster than any orange notice ever had, and by the time Nell held the Hangar's reopening that spring, the shape of the town's opinion of her had rearranged itself into something she recognized, with some wry private amusement, as a specific and familiar kind of small-town revision. Not quite an apology, but a visible, collective effort to be remembered as having believed in her all along. Linda Post found her near the coffee table Sarah had set up just inside the Hangar door, and stood for a moment turning a paper cup in her hands before she spoke. "I want to say something, Nell, and I'd understand if you didn't want to hear it." "Go ahead, Linda." "I signed that affidavit because Gary came to me looking scared and sad about his brother's widow, and I believed him because it was easier than asking hard questions about what he actually wanted out of it." Linda's eyes were steady. At least, Nell gave her that. "I'm sorry. Truly. It was a small, thoughtless cruelty, and you didn't deserve it. And I don't expect you to forget it, just because I said so on a nice afternoon in a nice hangar." Nell considered her for a moment, weighing the old hurt against the plain, uncomfortable honesty of the apology in front of her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want to carry the weight of that particular grudge any further than she already had. "I appreciate you saying it," Nell said. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't sting, but I'd rather spend what time I've got left being glad for the people willing to say a true thing out loud than keeping score on the ones who needed a little longer to get there. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not the clean, complete kind people like to imagine in stories. It was something closer to what Frank had offered her days earlier, and what she had, in turn, offered him, the messier, more honest kind of grace that made room for people's failures without pretending those failures hadn't happened. Richard Cole's final call came 2 days later. Nell answered it this time, standing in her kitchen with the winter light coming gold through the window, and let him finish his revised offer. Higher now, considerably higher, framed as though the increase were a gesture of respect rather than what it plainly was, which was simple market recalculation now that word had gotten around about what the property actually held. "The land's not for sale, Mr. Cole," she said, exactly as she had said it on her porch weeks before, and hung up before he could answer, and felt, doing it, a small, clean satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money in that safe, and everything to do with finally being able to say those words to a man who could no longer pretend not to believe her. The Hangar reopened, in its way, that spring. Nell had the outer bay's rusted siding repaired first, then the tarmac resurfaced, working with a contractor Frank vouched for personally, and by the time the first warm weeks of April arrived, the building that had spent 9 years being the town's favorite example of a foolish old woman's stubbornness had become, instead, something closer to a small local landmark. The place where Walter Whitfield's second restored aircraft, the one nobody in town had ever known existed, sat gleaming under lights in an open hangar bay on the Saturday Nell finally invited the whole town out to see it. Not out of spite. She was honest with herself about that, standing at the hangar door greeting neighbors who had spent years half hiding their laughter behind polite hellos. She hadn't opened the hangar to prove anybody wrong, exactly, though she wouldn't pretend there wasn't some quiet satisfaction in watching Linda Post's careful, apologetic expression as she walked through the door. She'd opened it because Walter had built something beautiful in secret for over 20 years, and secrets, she had decided, were not meant to outlive the reasons for keeping them. Frank stood near the second aircraft most of that afternoon, answering questions about its restoration with the patient. Technical pride of a man finally allowed to talk openly about work he'd quietly respected for years. Sarah had flown in for the weekend and stood near her mother most of the day, occasionally catching Nell's eye across the crowded hangar with a small, private smile that needed no explanation between them. Late in the afternoon, once most of the town had wandered back to their cars and the light was going long and gold across the tarmac, Nell walked alone into the inner bay, open now, no longer a secret, though she still kept both keys close, out of habit more than necessity, and stood for a while beside the small steel desk where she had first read Walter's letter. She had framed a single line from it and hung it on the wall above the desk, small enough that most visitors wouldn't notice it unless they looked, which felt, to her, exactly right. "Don't you dare let anybody in this town make you feel small for keeping a promise to me." She had kept it. 9 hard years, 11 desperate days, and 1 cold morning in a wood-paneled courtroom. She had kept every promise she'd made to a man who, it turned out, had been quietly keeping his own promise to her the entire time, in the patient, maddening, deeply loving way that had always been, most truly, Walter. Outside, she could hear Sarah's laugh carrying across the tarmac, and Frank's low, steady voice explaining something about engine maintenance to a cluster of curious neighbors, and beneath it all, the particular quiet of an airfield at the end of a good day, wind moving gently over cracked concrete, a hawk circling somewhere above the tree line, the whole wide, patient sky going gold and then rose, and then, slowly, the deep, quiet blue of evening. Nell stood a while longer, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, and let herself feel, without hurrying past it the way she'd taught herself to hurry past hard feelings for 9 long years, the full weight of being, at last, entirely and unmistakably believed. She thought, standing there, about all the versions of this story the town might tell in years to come, the widow and the hidden fortune, the brother who tried to take it, the developer who offered and was refused. She supposed some of it would get simplified in the telling, the way these things always did, sanded down into something tidier than it had actually felt to live through. Nobody retelling it at the diner counter would mention the 11 sleepless nights, or the particular cruelty of Linda Post's affidavit, or the long, complicated ache of loving a man enough to forgive him for a secret kept out of love rather than malice. They would remember the ending, the gold, the money, the courtroom gavel. She didn't mind that particularly. She had learned, over 61 years, that other people's versions of your life rarely belonged to you anyway, and the only version that had ever really mattered was the one she carried herself, the quiet, unglamorous, decade-long labor of keeping a promise nobody else believed was worth keeping, until the day it finally, unmistakably, was. What she would remember, when she let herself remember any of it at all, was not the money and not the courtroom. It was Walter's handwriting on that letter, patient and plain, telling her exactly what she had needed to hear at exactly the moment she'd needed most to hear it. It was Frank's flashlight beam finding the second aircraft in the dark, and the particular sound of 2 keys turning together in a lock, built to require both of them. It was Sarah's hand on her shoulder in a small concrete room, and the steady, unshowy loyalty of people who had chosen, again and again, across 9 hard years, to stand beside her instead of walking away. Some inheritances came all at once, in a single dramatic reveal behind a locked door. She understood now that the truest one Walter had left her had been arriving in pieces the entire time. In every quiet act of patience she'd practiced, without knowing what she was practicing for, and that the money in that safe, however welcome, however life-changing, had never really been the fortune he'd meant for her to find. Then she turned off the light, locked the door behind her out of old habit, and walked back out into the gold evening air to rejoin the people who had, in the end, stayed.